We're going to take some time to explore the different dashas and the ideas of different Ayanamshas, because this is a very hot topic. It's a very easily debatable topic. And when people write and they'll say, hey, I went to this astrologer and I got this dasha scheme. They told me I was in Rahu Jupiter. And I went to this other astrologer and they said, well, this person says I'm in Mars Moon. Why is there this difference? Which one is right? So we're going to try to address the reasons why some astrologers might say that you're in one dasha and another astrologer might say that you're in another dasha. We're also going to address today which one is right. Which dasha is actually going to be more accurate for you. Well, let's start with the many reasons why different astrologers might speak of different dashas or different time cycles. And this is where it gets really complicated, because we've been taught that there is really only one dasha. Most of us. I know there are probably some very well-read astrologers out there or astrology students who know now that there are more than one particular kind of dasha. But mostly when you read books on astrology, when you talk to most astrologers, they focus on one dasha system. They focus on the Vimshottari dasha. And that's the main dasha that a lot of people are supposed to use, particularly in this era that we're in. But what we're not told in the very beginning is that there are other Nakshatra dashas. For example, in Kala, if I right-click on this Vimshottari here, left click, what this is going to do is it's going to tell me, okay, well, the Vimshottari dasha is accurate. Yogini dasha, Ashtatari dasha, Shodashatari dasha, Shodashatari dasha. That one's always a mouthful for me. That these other dashas are also accurate. So on one hand, in Vimshottari, yes, the person might be in Mars dasha. But if we use the Shodashatari dasha, well, now we see they're in Venus dasha. If we use the Ashtatari dasha, well, they're still in Venus and they're getting ready to go into Sun dasha. And there's some confusion about how to use these dashas. But really, if you're using Kala, it will tell you when a dasha is applicable for your chart. Because these other nakshatra dashas that I listed, and there are more than what I just showed you here, they're only applicable when there are certain requirements met within your birth chart. So if I look at your chart and I see Vimshottari dashas a possibility, if I see Ashtatari and Shodashatari as a possibility, when I'm looking at your chart, I'm not only going to be looking at Vimshottari, I'm also going to be looking at these other dashas too. And ideally, when it comes to predictive work, this is why it takes so long. I'm going to try to see, is there confluence, is there a theme between all three of these dashas that are related, that are going to tell me this particular kind of event is going to occur. And if I see that in all three dashas, that prediction is going to be more likely true. Okay, again, this is just like looking at a birth chart where maybe there are three different influences on your career planet. One says success, the other says failure, one says meh. And so you have to kind of synthesize that. The same thing with dashas. If one dasha says success, the other says failure, the other says, well, maybe, well, you have to synthesize that. And that's the hard part about being a predictive astrologer, is there's so much to synthesize. So there's no surprise that it's, well, as I mentioned, a difficult task. The other thing that can be very helpful is sometimes one particular dasha sequence might just be overall more applicable to the person we're discussing. The requirements for each dasha, those are given in, I believe it's Brihat Parashar Shastra, if I recall correctly. It's going to give you hints, but this is also why, as an astrologer, I often take a little bit of a case study before I look at the chart. And I ask, tell me about three specific areas of life, or three specific things that occurred in your life that were big events. Number one, I do that to check the birth time, to see if the birth time is accurate, if it's lining up with what I see within the chart. Number two, I do that to look at the dashas, the different dashas, and say, well, is there one of these dashas that, above all else, shows that more often? Then I might put more emphasis towards that particular dasha sequence, whether it's Vimshottari or Ashtottari, whatever it might be. So asking questions of a client or someone who's really wanting predictive work can be very helpful to even find the most appropriate dasha. So you can see it's complicated. So that's the first thing that occurs. People might be using a different dasha system than just the standard Vimshottari dasha. And that can be difficult for individuals, especially when they're locked into saying, but I know from Vimshottari that this makes perfect sense. How can you tell me that now I'm in a different dasha? Well, it's looking at it from a different angle, and it's necessary in order to triangulate what's going to happen within the chart. So this is the first thing. The other thing, which is going to make dashas turn out differently, is how the person, the astrologer, has been trained to calculate the dashas. And this is going to relate to the Ayanamshas. Most people use the Lahiri Ayanamsha. And if you want to read more about the Lahiri Ayanamsha and the history of the Lahiri Ayanamsha, I'll put a link to part of an article I've been working on down below this video. So you might have to scroll through until you see Lahiri Ayanamsha. But if you want to know the basis for the Lahiri Ayanamsha, which is the most common Ayanamsha to be used, you can read about it there. But why might Ayanamshas be different? Well, while we have the idea that there's consensus, hard, firm, scientific consensus about the way the stars are related to the earth and so on, there actually isn't. Even in Vedic astrology, even though many people are sidereal astrologers in Vedic astrology, as a sidereal astrologer, I remember experimenting with, let's see, where was it here? So hopefully I can fit all this on the screen. But so I'm looking at the calculation options, the Ayanamsha screen and Kala. These are all the possible Ayanamshas that you can use. What most people use, as I've mentioned, is the Lahiri Ayanamsha. Well, there's a Krishnamurti Ayanamsha, there's a Raman Ayanamsha, there's a Yukteswar Ayanamsha, you can use the tropical Ayanamsha, Babylonian Ayanamshas, Galactic Center Ayanamshas. So how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 3, 24, 25. So we'll say there's over 30 Ayanamshas that you can choose from. And each of these Ayanamshas, they've been created by people who've done their own research, who have, to the best of their ability, thoughtfully tried to figure out a way to make sense of the relationship of the heavens to the earth, right? And so when I was getting into Vedic astrology, I remember using the Lahiri Ayanamsha because that's what I was taught. That's the one to use. But then being a Kriya Yoga teacher, reading Autobiography of a Yogi, having a lot of respect for Sri Yukteswar, I started using the Yukteswar Ayanamsha, which actually changes things, or can change things quite a bit. And I found that Yukteswar Ayanamsha works very, very, very well. Okay, so it may be that the reason dashas are different is because your astrologer is using a non-standard Ayanamsha. And hopefully the astrologer has done research and has thought through the reasons they're using that Ayanamsha, because they will be a much better astrologer if they have done that. If you have thought through the reasons to use the Lahiri Ayanamsha, and you know the real reasons why it's important, well then you will be a much better astrologer, because that will tell me, at least, that you have used your logic and your reason and your mental capacity to really come to an informed decision. If you use the Dhruva Galactic Center middle of Mula Ayanamsha, and you're not just doing it because everyone told you you should, or you're just trying to be difficult because everyone told you you shouldn't, and you know the real reasons why that's important, you will probably be a much better astrologer, because you will have used your mind to reason through and figure out why this might be more applicable. And there's plenty of options here. Now, nakshatra calculations. Again, How do you want to calculate their nakshatras? Dhruva equatorial, which I prefer. After using others, I found this to actually work quite a bit more accurately. On the ecliptic, which really doesn't make sense if you think about how the nakshatras are related to the earth, or neither. But either way, if you have thought it through and come to your own conclusions and you've tested it out and it works with you and your clients, well, you can see that things might change based on how you choose to apply different Ayanamshas and so on. So basically, here's the thing that you need to be aware of. If you are a student of astrology and you want to learn astrology, then you're going to need to become aware of the different kinds of dashas available, why you would use those dashas. If you're a student of astrology, you need to be aware of the reasons why certain Ayanamshas are set the way they are. Because what's going to happen is you'll go to an astrologer and they'll have something different than what you've been taught. And instead of listening to the astrologer and maybe learning something, you'll say, well, that can't be right. And maybe it is right, but you don't know because you've never explored it. All right, so we want to be very cautious about jumping to conclusions just by saying that, oh, well, I have to be in a Mars Dasha because I'm experiencing this. It may be that you are in another Dasha, and something is getting activated which will give you a similar experience. Like, for example, I remember experimenting with dashas, and I remember at one point seeing a chart that in one dasha system it should be in a Venus dasha. In another dasha system it should be in a moon dasha. And at first glance you could say, well, that's a radically different dasha. So how can it be that you are seeing experiences of both? Well, in this particular chart, the moon ruled over Venus. Venus was in the moon's house. So you're going to get some kind of similar overlap when you see things of that nature. Another one was you switched dashas a little bit, or you chose different Ayanamsha, and a person would go from being in a moon Rahu dasha to a moon Saturn dasha. All right, well, in this particular chart, we would have Rahu and Saturn mutually influencing each other, and then both on angles from the moon. So yes, there will be subtle differences through the Vargas, but just at first glance, it could be easy to confuse a moon Rahu dasha and a moon Saturn dasha, especially since Rahu acts like Saturn, and in this particular chart, both Rahu and Saturn were on angles from the moon. So that's why there is no real easy description about the whys unless you have gone through and studied astrology, and you can have a conversation about it with an astrologer. Say, well, let's see this, let's break it down, let's compare this. So there's a lot that goes into determining what is the most accurate dasha. Number one, the plethora of options that you have just by the different dashas that are available. Number two, how you choose to calculate your Ayanamsha, how you choose to calculate the nakshatras. In the previous video where I went over Kala, I was describing why I like Kala astrological software and things you can do with it. Let's see if I can pull it up here. Well, even with calculation options, let's set aside the different kinds of dashas, and let's set aside the Ayanamshas. Let's look at how to calculate the nakshatra dashas. What's the year length you use? Or do you start it from the moon, the lagna, or other planets? And there are actually texts that say, aside from using it from the moon, which is the standard, that's what I typically use, there are other texts that say, I believe it's Satya Jatakam, where it says, if the moon is stronger, do the nakshatra dashas from the moon. If the lagna is stronger, do it from the lagna. If the lord of the lagna is stronger, start the dashas from the lord of the lagna. So that's why you have the options of Sun, Mars, Mercury, and so on, if you want to follow that. I have not experimented with that enough, but I know it's a possibility, and I can see how it may be that actually is a variable that we need to consider that we don't. All right, so this is the reason that when it comes to defining what is the best dasha, why is there discrepancy of dashas, what is the best Ayanamsha, and so on, what it's going to come down to is, number one, how much astrology do you know so that you can go through and apply all the different techniques to find the one that works for you. Also, it depends on how you've been taught, what your beliefs are, which brings in the human component of things. But at the end of the day, you as an astrologer need to choose the Dasha sequence, the way you calculate the Dashas, based on your own informed understanding. Because you may know human nature. If I have gone through and I have studied and researched and come to a conclusion, I don't care how much new information you try to feed me, typically human nature, I'm going to say, yes, but this, right? That's just human nature. So at the end of the day, what it's going to boil down to is how much research have we done? How much have we learned? What is our own informed decision about how to calculate these things? It's going to tell us which is the best Ayanamsha, which is the best Dasha. This is why I discourage clients who have never studied astrology or have only studied it very peripherally to not worry about it, to just find the astrologer that works well for them and then listen to the astrological advice. In the same way that I'm not a doctor, so when I go to a doctor, I try to find the doctor who helps me feel better, who seems to be intelligent. I don't say, well, what medical tests did you do? Can you tell me all of the numbers for that medical test? I want to go look it up all by myself. And I'll tell you, I've not had very many serious illnesses, so that's good. But I have had difficulties with pets. I do enjoy animals. And I remember this is what brought it home for me. We took one of our animals to the vet, and they gave us a whole printout of all the blood work of this means that and so on. So I had pages of information that I know nothing about. And I'm looking at it and I'm saying, oh, but what about this bilirubin content? And I see this is way off the graph. And I got really stressed out about it. And the doctor said, look, he said, okay, I understand, but for this particular thing, this would have only been applicable if this would have been a fasting test, which it wasn't. So you see, I was jumping to conclusions about something in a test, in a variable, when I didn't have all the information because I was not trained in that way. So when it comes to being a client of astrology, find an astrologer that you trust, that seems intelligent, that can help you with your life. I would discourage you from trying to get into saying, but this astrologer said that, and this astrologer said that. Well, if you're going to another astrologer, why would you argue the point of previous astrologers, right? So on one hand, we want to empower you with knowledge, but on the other hand, if this isn't your profession, and if you're not going to spend all the time that it takes to really understand the reasons why an astrologer is doing or saying what they are, it's really best to just find a good astrologer that you can trust and work with. You have all these variables, all these options, and even with the most intelligent, well-read, well-informed astrologers, the debates can get quite heated and there's disagreements. So the world of astrology is very interesting in this way. All right, so these are the thoughts on best dashas and best Ayanamshas. Also, if you want some more information on dashas and how to consider dashas, I'll put a link as well at the bottom of this video. I did a free Nakshatra Dasha course on YouTube. I think it was a pretty long course where it talks about what to expect during the Sun Dasha, during Saturn Dasha, generally speaking. So I'll put a link to that if you want to explore that. And at AshevilleVedicAstrology.com, on the downloadable courses page, there's also a downloadable course specifically on Vimshatari Dasha and how to use it with transits and so on. So you've got some opportunities there that you can learn more, but realize that this is not an uncomplicated topic.